Have you ever prayed to God to move in your life only to find yourself frustrated by the way He chose to do it? Maybe you wanted a door to open, but it closed. Maybe you wanted clarity, but got waiting instead. Maybe you wanted comfort, but found yourself in a season of stretching. One of the most difficult realities in faith is realizing that God's plan doesn't always align with our preferences. And when that happens, we're forced to ask a deeper question. Do I trust God only when His plan matches what I want? Or do I trust God even when it doesn't? What's going on, my curious and intellectual people? Welcome back to Intriguing Insights, where deep conversations meet everyday life, looking beyond the obvious to uncovering meaning, challenge assumption, and find wisdom in places most people overlook. I'm your host, Terrence Tyler, and today we're exploring the tension between our desires and God's direction. Because sometimes our greatest obstacle to becoming the person that God created us to be isn't opposition from the world. It's the attachment to a life that we thought we wanted. Now let's get into it. What happens when God's plan doesn't look like the life you would have chosen for yourself? That's a good question, because that's where many people experience tension in their faith. We often trust God when His direction aligns with our preferences. But what happens when His plans lead somewhere uncomfortable, uncertain, and unexpected? That's when faith stops being a belief and start becoming a trust. Because there's a difference. Belief and trust appears to be the same, but they're not. They're similar, and they look like they're identical, but they are actually two different things. Belief is mainly intellectual, accepting that something is true. Now, trust goes deeper. It's relational and involves actually depending on God. It means acting on what you believe, following Jesus' teaching, depending on God even in difficult times, and letting faith shape how you live your life. Think of a bridge. Belief is knowing that the bridge is well built and safe. Trust is actually walking across it. We can intellectually believe that the bridge is solid without ever stepping onto it. Real faith is believing that it is true and trusting to use it. Could it be that some of our greatest struggles isn't about God's absence, but about God's direction? Sometimes we're not questioning whether God is speaking. We're questioning whether we like what He says. The yes, the no, and most of the times, it's the not right now. That waiting season is really real. And we can mistaken the not right now for a no. And with the yeses, we love those because then we trust them very well because it aligns with exactly what we wanted. And what does that reveal? For me, when I go through these type of circumstances, it helps me to understand the difference between wanting God's will and wanting God's will to match my preferences. So, before we talk about what this means, let's talk about what we can see. Because often, the patterns that we ignore are the lessons that we need to learn the most. So, what do I see happening in people's lives? I see people praying for purpose, but resisting the process. I see people asking God for growth while avoiding situations that requires growth. I see people wanting the promise without wanting the preparation. See, there's a story in the Bible that I like a lot. And the more I go to it, the more I get out of it. Now, it's a lot of theological context with it, and I'm going to try to be not expound on it as much as I know that I can. But it's a story about Moses leading the Israelites from Egypt. They had a week's journey to make it to the promised land, but it literally took 40 years for them to finally get there. Now, it was twofold. The 40 years also helped Moses, and the 40 years also helped the Israelites. The Israelites was in Egypt for many years, many years, and they grew up there and made families there. So they was conditioned with the Egyptians, which did not serve the one true God, Yahweh, at that particular time. Jehovah also being his name. And they needed to be reconditioned to trusting God rather than trusting their everyday circumstances and habits and cultural that they were raised and brought up in. So it took them 40 years in order to do it, to make it to the promised land, rather than that 1 week's journey that it was only going to take, because the promised land was given to them and was going to be given to them, but they had to go through the preparation first. So why did this happen? From my understanding, through my years of transformation with God, it's because his priorities are different than our preferences. We, as humans, tend to focus on comfort. But God, he focuses on transformation. So are there some examples on how we focus on comfort and God focuses on transformation? I have a few that I had to experience. And this was, we want immediate success, but God wants to develop character. We want quick answers, but God focuses on building patience. We want a door to open, but God may be preparing us to walk through that door. Again, the Israelites had a 1 week's journey to make it to the promised land of milk and honey, where God was definitely promised their forefathers that they were going to get the whole entire time that they were in Egypt. So they knew this and they understood it. And when Moses stood up and said they were going to do that, they wanted it to be there immediately. And when they did not make it there in that short period of time, boy, they gave Moses the blues. But God wanted to prepare them for the door of that promised land that they were walking through, to know when they get there, they will have their heart conditioned and prepared to serve him instead of serving the gods of Egypt, because that's a whole total different story. The 12 plagues were gods, but we're not going to go into that. Another thing, we want that immediate success, which, like the Israelites, they wanted it to happen immediately. We want immediate success. We want the positions. We want the income. We want the business to skyrocket. But God wants to develop that character inside of us. Why? Because once we have the character, we're able to stand firm, strong, and glorify his name as well in the midst of that position. of that financial development and passive income instead of us losing it, being idle and in vain. Because Solomon, Solomon was one of the wisest and richest men of all times. He's the one who wrote Proverbs. And Solomon fell hard. And why? Because he was excessive in his spending, buying this, buying that, buying everything. He even built a whole house for his wives because his wives wasn't the same believer. They were actually non-believers. And he built a house so that way that they can be separate, because he understood and knew that they couldn't partake into the people of God, because they was going to distort the things that God had commanded for them to live like. So he bought them something separate. And he bought a big temple for his own. He had gardens. He had all that. That was number one. Number two, he also became bored. So he started participating in certain things. Idle time is the devil playground. And you know a lot of rich people that is on social media that you see it all day long. These people, they participate in activities because they have nothing of central. They have nothing of substantial substance for them to live according to a way that is profitable and beneficial. It's that same way. God prepares us with our character. He prepares us for us to be able to walk through that door of the greatness that we want, so that way we can keep it and glorify him in the midst of it. Not for us to fall deep. Because for those who have children, you're not going to give your child $100 because you know that they are going to futilely spend that money. It's the same way with God and his children and his people. And sometimes we need that patience to be built in us as well, to understand that. So now this makes me think, is the conflict really between us and God? From my observations, I see that the conflict is between who we are today and who God wants us to be in the future. So what is the most common thing that people do when God's plan conflicts with our preferences? Many people become frustrated, discouraged, or confused. But why? Because they interpret the delay, the challenge, the redirection as God withholding something good. But is that always happening? Nah, not necessarily, I wouldn't say. Sometimes God is not withholding something good from us. Sometimes he's preparing something within you. Everything that we see is good might not necessarily be good. And sometimes God needs to prepare something inside of us so that way we'll be able to recognize that that thing that you thought was good and for you was really what he wants what's best from you. Because one thing we say, we pay attention to the outward appearance. The person that looks fabulous, that's dressed nice, that has the big income, the big promotions, driving the nice cars with the big house, and we immediately assume that that's good. But God sees the heart, knowing what they really feel, knowing what they really think, knowing what their true motives is and their intentions. Same with you. The exact same way. He's trying to purify those things internally, because once you become someone better, you would obtain the best. So, what is the difference? Perspective. One perspective sees rejection, the other sees development. Now that we have identified the tension, let's go a little deeper. Because seeing a pattern is one thing, but understanding what that pattern is trying to teach us is something different entirely. What does this tension actually reveal? It reveals what we truly trust in is. The circumstances exposes what's in our heart. How we naturally respond to circumstances when encountering them reveals what we truly believe. So when we are trying to walk in God's will and we have circumstances that encounter or challenge us that causes some type of discouragement, frustration, or confusion, this is what revealing what we are truly trusting in that moment. And it's whatever that's attached to this encounter when God involves himself into trying to stop or prevent or react in a certain circumstance. It's easy to trust God when his plan matches our expectations. But it's harder when obedience costs us something. So, what is faith really tested by? Faith is often tested when God's wisdom conflict with our preferences. The biggest conflict I have in my spiritual walk was and is the preconceived ideas, the previous beliefs and perspectives, and the conditioning that I had in the past. And when I read the Bible, it challenges me to relearn and restructure the way that I think. It's the renewing of my mind. And this is important because that's where spiritual maturity is being formed. Not when everything is making sense, but when trust remains, even when understanding doesn't. Is God's plan better than our preferences? That's the hardest truth to accept because preferences are based off of what we can see. God's perspective isn't limited by what we see. So, what are we missing? The bigger picture, the future consequences, the growth we haven't yet experienced, and the lessons that we are not aware of. God is able to understand the consequences of actions and the end goal of what those consequences will lead us to. We are not. God knows the complete process of how growth is developed. We do not. He knows that the conditions of each person's heart, what it takes them to if they continue, if it's bad, and where it can lead them to if they choose to take a better route. It's like a map with two different destinations, but many different paths in order to get there. When we oversee the map, we can see every road that can take us to get to that direction. And we can choose which one better suits us according to the time, the traffic, the experience that we want to see, and the place that we want to go. God sees us and life like we see the map from all different angles. Could it be that God is more concerned about who we're becoming more than what we're getting? Very often, yes. Because purpose is not just about arriving somewhere. It's about becoming someone. At this point, some of us may be realizing that we've been looking at certain seasons of life through the wrong lens. Maybe what felt like rejection wasn't rejection. Maybe what felt like delay wasn't denial. So let's consider another perspective. What if God's interruptions are actually invitations? What if the closed door is directing us instead of denying us? And how would this change the way we view disappointment? I can start asking different questions. Instead of asking, why isn't this happening? I can ask him, what are you trying to develop through this? So, could delay serve as a purpose? Absolutely. Every once in a while, I scroll through TikTok and I see these reels about people on the road and they barely get hit. They barely miss getting hit by a car by inches. I seen one where an individual was on a motorcycle and someone got their attention. And through that engagement, it kept them from going over the red light and end up getting hit or struck by a car. What we don't see and recognize that in some of these instances, that these delays is God's provision of protection. It keeps you from a tragedy that you don't see that's happening. But some of us, we choose to ignore God and we encounter the tragedy, but not even at its full extent, because his grace and his mercy is there. And that's when in hindsight, we can look back and we can hear God's voice and be like, this is what you try to keep me from. Delays can develop patience. Challenges can develop resilience. And waiting can develop dependence on God. So what if the process is a part of the purpose? Then every season, even the uncomfortable ones, are valuable. What if God's goals are not to make our life easier? What if God's goal is to make us more aligned with who he created us to become? So, would that explain why some seasons are difficult? Yes. Challenges brings growth. It pushes us. It stretches us. It creates depth. When we encounter conflict really shows what we're really made of. It's the fight or flight, fold or break, stand or run. Growth often feels uncomfortable because transformation requires change. And what happens when we resist that change? We still fight. Regardless, you're going to do that. It's inevitable. But instead of fighting to become better, we can end up fighting the process that's trying to shape us. So, what should we remember? God's plan may challenge our preference, but it never works against his purpose. A different perspective is valuable, but transformation only happens when perspective is put to action. It's one thing to know that the bridge is safe and solid, but it's another thing to actually use it. So the question becomes, how do we actually use this when God's plan doesn't make sense? We should respond with God's plan when it conflicts our preference with honesty. So acknowledge your disappointments, acknowledge your confusions, and acknowledge your frustrations, because you can't surrender what you are pretending don't really exist. Only way God can help you get through it and to deal with the circumstance is if you confess truthfully what you're dealing with. Because if you don't, that means you ain't ready to be accountable. It's like someone telling you something that you don't want to accept. Then how can you grow? How can you develop? And how can you be transformed? You haven't even accepted it as being true. Then what should I ask myself? Am I committed to God's purpose or to my preferred outcome? And why is this question so powerful? Because it exposes whether your trust is rooted in God or in what you want. And what's one practical mindset shift that I can make? Move from asking God what is happening to asking, what is God trying to show, teach, or develop in me through this? And how does this change things? It turns frustration to curiosity. It turns resistance to growth. It turns obstacles to opportunities for transformation. And what happens over time? You begin seeing life through the lens of purpose instead of preference. Now, as we bring this conversation to a close, I would like to leave you with one thought. Because this entire discussion comes down to a decision everyone eventually will have to make. And that's the decision to live according to your preferences or the goal to become who God created you to be. Maybe you're in a season right now where God's direction feels confusing. Maybe things are not unfolding the way you expected. Maybe you're wrestling with disappointment because the life that you envision and the life that you're experiencing don't look the same. But what if God's greatest work in your life isn't happening by the things that you're receiving? What if it's happening through the person that you're becoming? Because God's plan is not just about getting you to a destination. It's about developing you along the way. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is trusting God's purpose rather than your preference. If this conversation has challenged your perspective, share it with someone that needs the reminder that a delay isn't always denial, and a detour isn't always the mistake. Sometimes God's plan conflicts with your preferences because your preferences are focused on comfort. And God's plan is focused on your transformation. Remember, clarity doesn't come from easy answers, but from the courage to ask the hard ones. So stay curious, stay open, and keep looking deeper. Peace.